Greetings everybody, my name is Tommy the Game Master and welcome again to my channel. Well, I'm going to do a quick rant review on Castlevania Anniversary Collection, completely unscripted, just talk about it, tell you my thoughts on it. I've had this for a few months. I meant to do a review, just didn't have the time, and I'm glad I waited because in its original form, in its original release, Castlevania Anniversary Collection would have only gotten a so-so recommendation for me. It's a great collection of games, don't get me wrong, but it had problems with the way the controls worked and just a few other presentation problems that kept me from giving it a high recommendation. Now that Konami has patched some of these issues and thrown in the Japanese versions of these games, it's hard for me not to recommend this game collection. So let's go through the games real fast. You have the original Castlevania that was released on the NES clear back in the 80s. It is a great example of action platformers of its time. It's a really fun action platformer. You got the whip, that's always fun to use in these Castlevania games. You had your sub weapons. The platforming and the stage design is really great. The only problem might be towards the last two stages being a bit on the hard side. You're only allowed 4 hits per life towards the end of the game, and that can make it really frustrating. And the boss battles with Death, if you don't know how to cheat, and the boss battle with Dracula can be a little bit on the aggravating side, but overall it's a really fun game. Next up, it's Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, and this is the game that's notorious for launching the angry video game nerd's career. Now, personally, I don't think this is a bad game, but it's not a great one. It's one of those games that was ahead of its time and ahead of the abilities that the NES could do. For example, the NES couldn't really render a map of the area, so it made exploring really hard. Throw in that a lot of times game companies didn't give a lot of money towards localization because most of the time there was very little text in these NES games, and also very little memory to actually expand the text to. You get a game that's very confusing and very cryptic. I will give it credit for trying to do an open world design clear back in the 80s. I will give it credit for being a little different than the rest of the games on this collection. I'll also give high props to the fact that this is where the theme Bloody Tears was first started, and it's a really great theme. They've even used it on the Netflix Castlevania series. But it is frustrating to figure out. You do need a guide, and it's just not as fun as the rest of the games on this collection. Not the worst game on this collection also, but it's just not as fun as most of the rest. Let's move on. Alright, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. This one also changed the formula. It starts off with a bit of a long narrative, although the game itself doesn't have much narrative, but basically this one takes us back to the first battle between the Belmonts and Dracula. And basically it starts off with the fact that Dracula's taking over Wallachia and wants to destroy all of Europe. The Europeans have basically banished the Belmonts because they're scared of their supernatural powers, and only one now exists, Trevor, and it's up to Trevor Belmont to explore Transylvania and find a way to put a stop to Dracula. And if you're going, this is like the Netflix series, yeah, well, Netflix's animated series very much borrows from the story of this game, but again, the game is not very narrative, so they filled in a lot of the blanks. But it is a really great game. It plays much more similar to the original Castlevania, except that it's a lot bigger, and you do get to choose your path between the stages. After every stage you come to a fork in a road, you get to pick what area you go to next until you eventually wind up going through Dracula's castle. You also have 3 traveling companions. You got Grant Dynasty, the pirate that can jump. You got Alucard, who can shoot out fireballs. And you got Sypha Benaldez, who can do magic, and I don't think I recorded a lot of footage with these partner characters. For that, I apologize. But anyways, having these extra characters around does change the gameplay dynamic up too. And I think a lot of Castlevania fans would say this is the best game on this collection, and I wouldn't disagree if the next game wasn't included on this collection. Super Castlevania 4, story-wise, same as the original, Simon Belmont out to destroy Dracula, except this time the graphics have gotten a 16-bit overhaul. There's a lot more stages. You start on outside the castle grounds, trying to make your way up to Dracula's castle. Simon can now whip in multiple directions. You can flail the whip. It's just an extremely fun game to play. The only problem I have is that for 2/3 of the game, it's extremely easy, especially compared to the NES Castlevanias, until you get to Dracula's dungeon. And once you hit Dracula's dungeon, the difficulty spikes up a lot, and it can get a little bit frustrating from there. But overall, this is probably the most balanced of all the Castlevania games on this collection. And if you're a beginner, I would probably recommend starting this one first, at least if you're just going through the American ROMs. Next up is the worst game on this collection, hands down probably the worst Castlevania game, Castlevania The Adventure for the Game Boy. And I almost want to cut this game some slack since it was a launch game for the Game Boy or towards the beginning of the Game Boy's lifespan, and I don't think the developers quite understood the system's power or lack thereof, because a lot of times what seems to plague this game is slowdown, and I mean constant slowdown. Second there's even a background image, the game just slows to a crawl. Anyways, yeah, like I said, it's slow. It just takes forever to go anywhere, to get anything done. You just feel like it's a slog, which is kind of a shame. The stage design in this isn't bad, but just moving your character, controlling the game, it's just a nightmare. Skip this one. Then we have Castlevania 2 The Adventure, which does a little bit better. It's not quite as slow. Stage design is still there. You get to pick your stages because you got 4 of them, but there is still some areas of the game that are just a frustrating mess. The next to final boss battle with Sue Belmont was a frustrating nightmare. I don't think I would have even tried to get past it without the emulation quick save that this collection provides. It's a decent game, but it's not great. It's way better than the first adventure game, but it's worth skipping. Then finally we have Castlevania Bloodlines. This one was released for the Sega Genesis. It was kind of notorious because Nintendo had censored a lot of Super Castlevania 4, a lot of the blood. Sega wasn't going to do that, and Konami let people know that because you get things like corpses, a lot more blood and gore in this one than you did with the Nintendo made ones. But how did it play? For the most part, this one's okay. It does add something, and it's even in the Japanese version, which kind of surprised me, is that there's limited continues, and that just doesn't feel right in a Castlevania game. But outside of that, it's still a pretty fun game. You have 2 characters to choose from. They have slightly different abilities that do open up different paths in the game. I usually choose Jonathan Morris or Johnny Morris if you're playing the Japanese version. And it has some interesting stage design. It's not as good as Super Castlevania 4 in my opinion, but it is a fun game worth checking out. And then I guess there is one more game I need to talk about in this collection, even though it's not technically a Castlevania game. It is tied to the series. It is a parody game called Kid Dracula. Apparently that 10,000 years after Dracula's final battle with the Belmonts, he awakens and finds out some other demon has stolen his entire group of minions. He gets pissed and he wants them back. And again, this is a parody game. The characters are kind of cute. The level designs are kind of more bouncy. It looks more like this could have been a Tiny Toons game that Konami had made and decided to throw in their own character to. As Dracula, you're able to throw out fireballs, you're able to charge up fireballs, and you learn some cool new abilities like spread shots and bat transformation and how to turn the gravity upside down. And it's actually a pretty fun, if very different game from the others. Um, if there was one thing I want to warn you guys about is when I first approached this and played through the first few levels, I thought this game would be a cakewalk. The later levels in this do turn into Castlevania 3 type territory, the Western release of Castlevania 3 with some of the really tricky platforms and some of the boss battles. In fact, the final stage really is you doing about 4 or 5 boss battles in a row without any health or checkpoints. So this game can be quite tough despite its cutesy appearance, and it's definitely worth checking out. Then we do also have the Japanese ROMs that Konami added to them. So what are the differences? Are they worth checking out? Well, I've checked out most of them. I didn't check out the 2 adventure ones, and quite frankly, don't really want to play those Japanese or American anyways. But the original Castlevania, the original Famicom version was on disc. When they did release it on cartridge several years later, they threw in an easy mode. This is a great way to experience the original Castlevania if you're a new gamer, if you're not into really hard NES platformers. It doesn't quite go into Maverick Hunter mode like the Mega Man X series collection does, but it does a good job of rebalancing the game to be easier. You start off with 9 lives, a lot more hearts, and the enemies don't quite do as much damage, but you still gotta get through Drax Castle. There was still some challenge. Me personally, I still prefer to play the game on normal, but I think it's a great mode. Then there's Castlevania 3. They skipped Castlevania 2 due to the fact of all the text and stuff. I don't see it being a good idea for them to ever put Castlevania 2 Japanese version, but they skip right to 3. The major and minor differences of 3 people could do whole videos on, and people probably have done full YouTube videos on. But let's just put it this way. The Japanese version of Castlevania 3 is probably why people demanded the Japanese ROMs on these collections. You have better music. You got a way more balanced gameplay. Konami didn't completely Bayou Billy Castlevania 3 up, but it is significantly harder in its Western releases, and there's a lot of differences. The biggest difference I can tell, like gameplay-wise, I could show you, is that Grant here in the West was kind of a character I didn't understand why anyone would want to go out of the way to pick up. You have to do an extra stage up a very difficult clock tower to pick him up, and he's got a good jump, but he's got a crappy knife attack, and he really isn't worth picking up compared to Alucard and Sypha. In the Japanese version, he throws that knife, so he's a projectile character, and it makes him a lot more useful, and it lets you do things with them that you couldn't in the American version. You know, new strategies against bosses open up when you use them, and I enjoy it. And like I said, throw in the better music and just more checkpoints and balanced gameplay. This is the Castlevania game to play despite a lot of Japanese text. Then we have Super Castlevania 4, which Nintendo censored here in the West. You get things like blood on the opening scene, uncovered statues in Dracula's castle, and of course the big changes come when you enter the dungeon, as rather than being filled with acid, you see pools of blood, and you see blood all over the spikes and stuff, giving it a lot more eerie feel. There isn't much of a change as far as gameplay goes, other than the whip now sounds different. Overall, I don't see myself really playing the Japanese version of Super Castlevania 4 all that much, but the differences are there. It's noted, and I enjoyed the fact that they gave us this option in this collection. Again, like I said, didn't really play through the Game Boy games again, so I'm not going to talk about them here. As far as Vampire Killer, which is the Japanese version of Castlevania Bloodlines, there are some small differences when it comes to the balancing. I noticed that the normal mode was a bit easier than the American version, but we're not talking about a lot of differences. A lot of people point out really the biggest difference in this game is the way Eric Lacarde looks in the cutscenes, and I have to agree with that. In the Western version, Eric Lacarde looks like he's a strapping young man. He's got a masculine face. In the Japanese version, even by anime standards, that's a chick's face. He looks like a girl. I don't know why they chose that character design, but Konami was wise to fix that in the Western release. But there isn't too much here that I can think of. And then you also have the Japanese version of Kid Dracula. I played that a little bit. Other than a lot of Japanese text, I didn't see the difference. Kid Dracula was never released here in the West anyways. Why they felt like they needed to throw in the Japanese ROM, I don't know. I figured maybe they had already started to change things in the game to align with Nintendo censorship policies that were common in the early to mid 90s. But I didn't see any. Even the Can mini game here where women show off their underpants, it's still the same in both the West and Japanese version. So I don't understand why they decided, and I think it would be kind of hard to finish this one because there is a trivia game, and if it was all in Japanese, I don't think I could even beat this one. So I don't quite understand why they stuck Kid Dracula's Japanese ROM on this collection. I mean, it's a nice idea, but unless there's a major difference I'm not aware of, I don't see the point. Anyways, my overall thoughts on this collection, it's worth getting. My only real complaint is that in order to do a 4:3 proper screen, to get the right ratio, you have to use the scanline filter. And the scanline filter isn't bad, but I wish they gave me an option to turn it off and still keep a 4:3 ratio. Why they didn't include that as an option, I don't know. But other than that, that's my one complaint against this game. Most of the games here are pretty good. Castlevania 2, Castlevania The Adventure have problems. But most of the games here are worth getting, and it's worth $20, especially for those Japanese ROMs. This is Tommy the Game Master, thanking you for listening. I'll see you guys later.